Okay.
Renato.
Okay, can we start? Okay, it's now officially 7 o'clock. And I welcome everyone to this section, this last session of the day. And we have Professor Uri Maoz as our guest. And okay, so Uri Maoz, he's a computational and cognitive neuroscientist at Chapman University, as well as a visiting professor at UCLA and a visiting associate at Caltech. His research lies at the intersection of volition, decision-making, and moral choice. He uses a combination of empirical techniques like EEG, intracranial recordings, behavioral studies, and theoretical modeling to develop a computational account of volition, with an emphasis on decision-making processes that lead to voluntary action and the role of consciousness in such processes. In particular, he uses machine learning to carry out online, real-time, closed-loop analysis of neurodata as it's recorded. He's further interested in the legal, ethical, conceptual, and economic implications of this work. He also directs a large international project comprising about 20 neuroscientists and philosophers who aim to understand how the brain enables conscious control and human decision-making and actions, the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project. So in addition to being a prolific researcher, Uri is undoubtedly one of the most influential promoters of the debate between neuroscientists and philosophers in the field today, coordinating worldwide interdisciplinary efforts in all of the themes discussed in the present colloquium: free will, agency, and its ethical implications. We could definitely not have an important event on such topics without his participation, for which we're very honored and grateful. And apart from all of that, I have to say personally that Uri is a very, very nice guy. So Uri, thank you very much. We're very, very glad to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Renato, for this very humbling, I should say, introduction. I shall try to live up to those standards with my talk. I guess one thing I have learned is that I'm not a very good philosopher, and I need to talk to my philosophy colleagues to understand some of the concepts that I'm studying as a neuroscientist. And I mean, I've never realized how much not being good at something would get so many people excited, because I do create these collaborations to be able to really do something in my field. But again, thank you very much. Yeah, so besides all these things here related to free will, again, thank you for inviting me to this conference. Today I'll talk about intentions and action formation in arbitrary and deliberate decisions. But I think I should start with a bit of an introduction. I must also apologize. Unfortunately, we have this big collaboration that Renato mentioned. We have our annual conference exactly this week. Of course, it had to happen exactly in the same week, which meant for me that I was not able to attend. We just finished our thing, and then I moved immediately to this meeting. So I was not able to attend previous talks. So if I repeat something that has been said before me, I apologize to you guys in advance. Hopefully, I won't bore you too much. Okay, so I think to this crowd, I don't have to say that free will did not start with neuroscience. Free will has started well before neuroscience, and I'm just really going over some Western thinkers just because this is the field I know better. I understand and know somewhat that this, of course, has been studied in other cultures as well. but roughly every Western philosopher had something to say about free will, every major one. And it's kind of interesting, if you look at the progression here, so Plato, Thomas Aquinas, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, then Harry Frankfurt here, so you can see the progression, right? Plato, we still have the statues, then it goes to pictures, and then at some point becomes black and white photographs and color photographs. So throughout really history up and into the 20th and 21st century, we have free will being a major thing, a major theme in philosophy and in theology. More recently, towards the end of the 20th century, 1983 in particular, there was a seminal paper published by Benjamin Libet, this person, that really threw neuroscience into the free will debate. And let's try to understand a little bit about why. So I will ask you now to do something. I ask you to decide whether to raise your left or your right hand. And if you've decided, now go ahead and raise that hand that you decided to raise. Okay, so if you did that, your experience is that you first of all consciously decided which hand to raise. Let's say this hand, and then you raised your hand. And you feel that there is a causal relation. This conscious decision to raise your hand then causally made you raise your hand. At least that's what most people report, this experience. So if you just ask about what happens in time, if this is time here, then the intuitive order of events is that you start with the onset of the conscious intention. That happens. Then sometime after that, you've got the information that exists in the brain about the action, okay, sometimes after that, and then movement onset, you actually move. Now, remember that intuitive order of events when I tell you about the Libet experiment. So in the Libet experiment, and this is really an experiment that launched 100 papers, if we paraphrase Christopher Marlowe here for a moment. In this experiment, people were just asked to, let's say, sit and look at a rotating dot. I'll show you in a minute, this dot will start rotating, but they sit and they look at a rotating dot, and all they have to do is to decide at some point, let's say in this version of the experiment, at some point, whether to raise their right hand or their left hand. Again, there are different versions of the Libet experiment, but let's say that that's the decision they have to make. So they sit there, they think about when, they think about which hand they want to raise. When they decide, when it's like, okay, they raise that hand, and they have to look at the clock and say where this spot here was when they first had the urge to move. Okay, when they first had the urge to move. So let's run the experiment. Okay, the dot starts rotating. At some point, the person makes the decision, and maybe to raise their left hand. And maybe they say the dot was, I don't know, around 8 when I decided to raise my right hand. So at the same time that all of this is happening, the person actually has EEG electrodes on their head. So they measure their what's called electroencephalography, their EEG. And what you see in the head is what you see in EEG is this thing called the readiness potential. And it is this ramp down or ramp up, depending on which direction you want your positive or negative axis to be, of activity leading on to movement onset. So if this is the head, the nose is here, and this is roughly somewhere here in the middle. Okay, it's called electrode CZ or CZ if you're British. And what you see, again, is this readiness potential. And this readiness potential begins before movement onset. However, interestingly, it begins more than just before movement onset. Okay, this is movement onset. This is the readiness potential. And let's say that maybe somewhere around here, about a second before you move, there's some information that already exists in the brain that you're about to move. At least that's what we infer from the readiness potential, or what's sometimes called the RP. However, if we ask, where did people report that they're about to move? Okay, that thing with the rotating dot, where did it stop? Where did they report that they're about to move? This happens around here. So about 200 milliseconds before. So you move here, you report that you're about to move here, but there's information in the brain that you're about to move already well back here. So that's the weird thing that's happening. Now, why is that weird? Because we talked about the intuitive versus deliberate order of events. So the intuitive order of events we talked about before, the onset of the conscious decision, then there's information in the brain, and then you move. But in the deliberate experiment, you've got information in the brain, then the onset of the conscious decision that people report, and only then you move, right? So you've got this strange situation of what's happening in this time range here. Well, what's happening is that there is information that exists in the brain about the action, but the subject does not yet report deciding. So was the decision made unconsciously? Actually, even some people started saying that the brain knows that you're about to move, but the person doesn't know. So like your brain knows before you do and things like that. So as a quick aside, I want to say that this idea that your brain knows before you do is a bit of a confusing notion. And it suggests that there is one entity or one subject that is the brain and another subject that is you. And the brain is has one state and you have another state, which is really weird. And just again, as an aside, Liad Mudrik and I at some point wrote this paper called Me and My Brain, Exposing Neuroscience's Closet Dualism, where we talk about how people sometimes speak about the brain, even though they claim they're materialists, they start speaking about the brain as though they're really dualists. So, but again, that's an aside to our story here. Going back to our story, this Libet experiment that I just described to you, where some people thought that maybe it means that decisions are made unconsciously, has created quite a stir. It's been cited more than 3,500 times, I think 3,560, and the last time I looked, it's probably more by now. If you look at the Libet experiment just in the New York Times, as an example, it's already been mentioned more than 120 times. So it's quite a thing. It's quite a paper that people like to talk about. Now, you might say, well, it's a bit of a weird result. Did anybody ever bother repeating it? So the answer is yes. It has been repeated a few times. Again, there were a few papers, some of those I mentioned here. In 1999, Haggard and Eimer repeated that experiment. And actually, they were the first ones to show that you can look at the left hand versus the right hand. The original Libet experiment, you were just asked to raise one of your hands. So it wasn't about which hand to raise, it was just about when do you want to move. So they show that you can raise one or the other hand, and you also get a similar idea. You get this readiness potential. Again, some people like in EEG, they like to show negative is up. It's just a historical convention. So that's why sometimes you see the EEG is going upward, and sometimes you see it is going downward, depending on where you look. Some might say depending on how old the person writing the paper is, because the older people go with this convention of going of the negative being upward, but whatever. Anyway, so this EEG was found maybe, this readiness potential was found maybe 1 second before you move. But then people said, well, the readiness potential is 1 second before you move. The person describes having decided to move about 200 milliseconds before. So, I mean, there's not so much difference, So first of all, some of these papers, actually here you can see it's maybe even 2 seconds before. So the EEG in 1983 was not as good as it is today. So maybe 2 seconds and so on. But still people said, well, maybe these 1 second, 2 seconds, it's not a big enough difference between when people report having decided to move or having had the first urge to move and when the RP started. So then came a paper from the lab of John Dylan Haynes in Berlin, this Sun et al. Paper, that showed that with fMRI, these people were now asked to press a button with the left or right hand. And you can see here, I don't know how well you can see, it's a bit small, sorry, but you can decode some information about which hand they would raise up to 8 seconds before they move. 8 seconds. So this is kind of suggested that it's not about the fact that you can only decide, well, you only see the RP 1 or 2 seconds before. If you can see information in the brain 8 seconds before, then, well, it's probably not a matter of time here. And even this is work from the lab of Yitzhak Fried, actually here at UCLA, not far away from where I am right now. And they looked at single neurons in humans that were being, I mean, this is part of a clinical evaluation that they were able to record these single neurons. And you can see these kind of like upward trends in single neuron activity and some downward trends that seem to mimic this readiness potential. Okay, so let's try to analyze the argument in the Libet experiment. So we have, let's look at the inference actually that Libet was making, okay? What Libet found, the finding is that the readiness potential, this RP, sometimes, by the way, the readiness potential is called Bereitschaft potential because it was originally discovered by a German pair of scientists by Kornhuber and Dicke in 1965, and they called it the Bereitschaft potential, which just means readiness potential in German. And sometimes you see it as RP or sometimes as BP because of the Bereitschaft potential, just so you take that into account. But anyway, so the RP precedes the reported decision onset. That's what Libet found. The RP precedes the reported decision onset. That's all that Libet found. However, very quickly, Libet inferred from that the decisions in this Libet experiment were made unconsciously. And I mean, very quickly, it's already in the subtitle of his original paper from 1983, okay, the unconscious initiation of a freely voluntary action. So that's the first inference. The second inference is from the idea that decisions in the Libet experiment are made unconsciously, is the claim that generally decisions are made unconsciously. And if generally decisions are made unconsciously, and by the way, again, this is, we don't have to go too far, in the 1985 paper, this is 2 years after that, it's a BBS paper from 1985 where Libet discusses this along with a lot of other people who kind of went back and forth on a commentary. It says unconscious cerebral initiative and the role of conscious will in voluntary action. So more generally now, in voluntary action, not, yeah. And the thing is that if generally decisions are made unconsciously, it really leaves no role for consciousness in decision making. And if all our decisions are unconscious, right? If we, the biggest decisions in life to some smaller decisions, they're all unconscious, this creates a problem because most legal systems require some kind of conscious involvement, if not control, over decisions for them to be considered voluntary. So if somebody does some kind of crime and they can prove that they were doing that while sleepwalking, they were not conscious, so maybe they're not held responsible. So if all our actions are governed by unconscious decisions, then it really is unclear what we're responsible for. So this is, I think, some of the reasons that the Libet experiments have created such a stir. But remember, to go from this to this, we've made all of these inferences, okay, from the Libet finding to generally decisions are made unconsciously. And I'd like to look at that a bit further. In particular, I'd like to look at this inference here and say that decisions are, that there are some assumptions that are made. One of them is that decisions are decodable from brain activity online and in real time. So to go from this to this, I mean, what you usually do in an EEG experiment is you measure your subjects, you collect it on a computer, then the subject goes home, and then you analyze it in a few weeks, a few months, or if you're really unlucky, a few years later, you sit there and you do all the analysis, and you say, aha, here is the readiness potential. Here's where the subject moves. See, I could have predicted it. If I would have been there at the time and I could have computed all of this on the spot, then I could have predicted the subject is about to move. So the first question is, well, does all of this really work in real time as things are happening? Or is it all just something you can compute much later on? Now, the second question is a question of early prediction versus early determination. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but briefly speaking, so you see that the person is about to move. Is it really that the person is about to move, or is there some kind of indication that maybe probabilistically the person is about to move? There's some probability that's now getting higher and higher, perhaps, that the person is about to move, but it's not that the decision has already been made. And again, we'll talk more about this. Last, of course, there's this big jump here that suggests that if the decisions in the limit experiment were made unconsciously, then decisions in general were made unconsciously. And well, we have to see whether the limit experiments really generalize to deliberate decisions. So those decisions like, which job to take, which school, you get accepted into 2 different schools, which one to go to, whether or not to get married, who to get married to, like all these big life decisions. Those are typically deliberate decisions, okay? So, yes. Now note that all of these decisions are necessary to go from the limit experiment to these general decisions that are made, generally decisions being made unconsciously. They're necessary, but I don't think they're sufficient, okay? Now, I mean, nobody, I think, thinks they're sufficient, but they are necessary. So if not all of them hold, then this inference doesn't hold. Okay, so let's continue. So first of all, are decisions decoded from brain activity online and in real time? So we wanted to look into that experimentally. So we created this situation where we worked with patients who were implanted with electrodes for clinical purposes. These are EEG patients. Sorry, these are epilepsy patients that are undergoing intracranial. So inside their head, they have electrodes to monitor their epilepsy. And this happens in certain situations where medicine no longer helps. And the only way to help these patients is to go and find if there is an epileptic focus. So if there's a specific place in the brain where the epilepsy starts, typically the epileptic seizures start. So you could actually go into that area of the brain, which doesn't do much except start epileptic seizures. And if you can remove that very carefully, then you could make the person's life much better than before. And some people have epileptic seizures every few hours. Each epileptic seizure actually destroys your brain a little bit. So you really don't want to have them every few hours. So this is, if drugs don't help these people, this is really the only thing that we can do to help. So as they locate where the seizures are coming from, typically these people spend a week, 2 weeks, even 3 weeks in the hospital, just sitting there waiting for seizures to happen. And at that time, we can go in and we can say, hey, would you mind doing some experiment with us? And we can record from those electrodes that are sitting inside their brains. So we created this, it's called a matching pennies game. The idea is it's a bit like the kids' game of rock, paper, scissors, but instead of rock, paper, or scissors, now you can decide whether you're going to raise your right hand or your left hand. And let's say if we were playing this game and we were going 1, 2, 3, go, and then we each raise our right. Let's say if we raise the same hand, then you win. If we raise different hands, then I win, something like that. So I played this game with the patients. We're looking at a monitor here where it says 3, 2, 1, go. And it tells us also who wins. We have this response box here, this thing that we raise our hand. And each of us has a little bit of, we each, I think, each round is on for 10 cents. So we each lose or win 10 cents. Now, interestingly, behind the patient, they cannot see it. There is this monitor that tells me which hand I need to raise to beat the patient. It tells me that just before the go signal to move that we get on this computer. And I'm sitting there with earphones and actually being told with a ping in my ear, there's a tone playing in the ear for my hand that I need to raise that hand to win. So the patient is, there's a human in front of the patient, but actually they're playing against themselves, because what we're doing is we're recording their brain activity and in real time trying to predict which hand they're going to raise. And we also try to make it more real. Instead of just raising a hand for no reason and no purpose, here they're trying to raise a hand because they want to win. they want to win the game. So if they get more money than me in the end, then they would actually get that money from me in cash. If I get more money, then of course nothing happens. We wouldn't take money from the patients. But if they get more money than me, then I actually give them that money in cash. So we created, as I mentioned, this whole real-time system, information going from the patient and analysis, machine learning, a lot of fancy stuff. But in the end, it tells me which hand to raise. And let's see, I hope it'll work. I wanted to show you a little bit of what it looks like. Yeah. So what you see here, 5, 4, 3, this is what, I mean, you can't see this screen, so I'm just replicating that for you. It goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you'll hear a click. The click, and here, this actually tells me which hand to raise. And you see that I'm raising this hand. The click comes a little bit before I have to raise my hand. It tells me which hand to raise. And then in this case, I raised the right, I think in this case, I had to raise a different hand from the patient to win. And you can see we raised different hands. So I won 10 cents. I win again. And so on. Actually, if we continued the recording a little bit more, you would hear this patient saying something like, wait a minute, what's going on? You're always winning. Now, I mean, I didn't always win, but I did win quite a bit. So we were able to predict what the, we were able to predict what the patient would do about 80% of the time. I'm not going to get into what all the other colors mean, but about 80% of the time we were able to predict what the patient would do. So this comes to show you, I mean, I should just mention, this is joint work with Shenzhuan or Jerry Ye, Ian Ross, Anna Mamelak, and Christoph Koch. And this actually suggests that first question of are decisions decodable from brain activity online and in real time? Well, they seem to be. Okay. So then the second question comes of, well, we talked about this early prediction. Is that really that the decision has been made in the beginning of the readiness potential, or is it just some kind of probabilistic thing? So do these early prediction signals, do they reflect early determination? Has the decision really been made? Or is it, again, is it something else? So as I mentioned before, there are basically two choices here, okay? That the early predictive signals that we see, this readiness potential or these things that John Dylan Haynes saw in the fMRI, all that stuff, they could be an indication of that the decision has already been made. And well, you know, we can't predict perfectly because we just don't have the technology. If we had access to all the neurons and so on, we would have been able to predict perfectly 2 seconds, maybe 8 seconds before the person would move. Okay, so that's one option, is that the decision has already been made. The other option is that there is just probabilistic information. The decision has not yet been made. Okay, there's just now more probability that I raise my left hand or my right. There's some kind of a bias going on or something like that. So, okay, if that's the case, if it's just probabilistic information, then even if we had the best technology in the world, we would never be able to perfectly predict. Okay, so think about it like this. Let's say that you're going out for dinner, and if you're going out for dinner in the US, it might be between, let's say, deliberating between, let's say, pizza and a hamburger, and you're sitting there and maybe both are on the menu, and maybe you have some kind of a preference for, you know, for let's say for pizza, but you haven't really made up your mind yet. So maybe what I can see is this: you have a preference. Maybe in the end you'll still go for the hamburger, but maybe you have a preference. Okay. And you know, you prefer the pizza, but your friend says, you know, actually I heard the pizza here is not that good, so you're now going to take the hamburger. Yeah, I mean, things could, you're still kind of in flux about your decision. Well, anyway, so let's tell you what we did this experiment to try to look into this, and let me tell you a little bit about that experiment. So in that experiment, we use what's called a temporal discounting task. In humans, those experiments typically go something like, do you want $1 now or $5 in half an hour or something like that? So, and each person, you know, if I ask you, maybe you say, well, half an hour, $5, sure. So, okay, what about $5 in a year? So then most people would say, you know what, I'll take the $1 now, because who knows if in a year $5 are going to be worth that much? Am I really going to come back and give you the money and all that? So still, there's this choice that you have to make. Now, this is an experiment. We reanalyzed some data that was collected by in the lab of Dale Lee, who was then at Yale, and it was collected with monkeys. Monkeys don't care that much about dollars. What they do care is about juice, because they like apple juice. So the question for the monkey is, do you want a little bit of juice now or more juice a bit later? And the way it worked was that the monkey was kind of looking at the screen that was empty. And then at some point they were told whether the little bit of juice is going to be on the left or on the right, and the large amount of juice would be on the other side. And they were also told, like, what is the delay for the small amount of juice? What's the delay for the large amount of juice? And then they can make up their mind, right? So while they're just looking at the screen and it's empty, they have no information about what's going to happen. They're just sitting there and waiting. So it kind of looks like this. We were sitting there, and the monkey's just waiting for something to appear, and we were tracking their brain activity while they're waiting, right? And we found these neurons that, while the monkey is sitting there and waiting, already they show some kind of bias activity. Sometimes they show bias activity. The monkey prefers moving to the left more than moving to the right. Sometimes we found bias activity for the monkey preferring a large reward over a small reward. But anyway, before the experiment could begin, let's say if we are looking at this left-right behavior here, or neural activity. So this suggests that the monkey is going to go leftwards, right? So the monkey is going to go leftwards. Then the choices come up, and the monkey tends to select the thing on the left. Now, again, as I mentioned, we did these various analyses. We found these neurons that prefer left versus right. We found them in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC brain region, kind of here. Then in the ventral striatum, we also found these neurons that prefer left versus right. And going back to the DLPFC, we also found what we call these reward neurons that preferred large versus small reward. So talking about decision-making a little bit here, we created this model that I sometimes call it the noisy scales model. The idea is that you have scales where you put your preferences. So do you want the large reward now or the small reward now? Do you want to buy a hamburger or a pizza? Do you want to get married to this person or not get married to that person? And so, I mean, it could be a large or small decision, but there are values, there are some preferences that you have. And if overall the preference for the right is much higher than the preference for the left, then the thing on the right is going to win, even though there's a little bit of noise here, okay, that you're introducing into this. But in situations where there are really no preferences, so the preference for the left and for the right is roughly the same, then it's mainly the noise that would win. So now I should say one more thing about this monkey experiment that we talked about before. It's not that we were able to predict the choices of the monkey every time. Sometimes the monkey was asked, do you want a little bit of juice now or a lot of juice now? Now the monkey would almost all the time take a lot of juice now, because again, that's that situation where it's very clear that they have a strong preference for a lot of juice now, very little preference for a little bit of juice now, and the noise is not going to decide it. But in situations where the monkey was kind of undecided, it's 50-50. Well, maybe I'll take a little bit of juice now, maybe I'll take a lot of juice in 6 seconds or something like that. That's where this activity that we saw well before the monkey even, or a few seconds before the monkey even saw the cue, saw the information about the decision, we could predict what the monkey would do in these 50-50 situations. So, because again, according to this model, in that situation, that's where it's really the noise that decides, because the values are not there to decide. Now, I mean, I'm not going to go into this. We developed this whole neural network. Well, it's called a circuit model with a winner-take-all circuit and biased neurons and so on. If you want, you can find more information in this paper, and I'll give the full reference at the end of the talk. But this is not, it was not some hand-wavy model. It was actually like complete, the mathematical differential equations and so on were all there. But for the important thing for us are the conclusions. So we found this biased neural activity, this activity that tells you what the monkey prefers before they even see anything on the screen. So it couldn't be a decision. They couldn't even start deliberating. There's nothing on the screen. They're just waiting for the trial to begin. Yet we already see some kind of bias activity. We already see some kind of preference. So this suggested to us that this early pre-deliberation activity is really a bias. Okay, it's only probabilistic. It's not that the decision has already been made, because again, if when the choice comes on, you get something that's you really prefer versus something you don't, you're going to override that. Okay, so going back to our slide before, whether it's early predictive information or not, we see that it's actually early probabilistic information. So it's this thing that seems to be correct as far as that experiment. So now, if I should just mention that this is joint work with all these people here, especially with Uri from Cedars-Sinai. But also, I mean, these people three people used to be at Yale. They've now different places. And again, Christoph Koch, who was at Caltech at the time and now at the Allen Institute. So going back to this, it seems that at least there is some evidence, perhaps not very strong, but some evidence that the early prediction signals, like the RP, don't really reflect decisions. So this is already starting to challenge this idea from the Libet experiment that if the RP precedes the reported decision onset, that it means that generally decisions are made unconsciously. So the question is this. Okay, let's say that we even buy that the decisions in the Libet experiment are made unconscious. Let's say that we buy that. It's really decisions. It's not probabilistic. It's not a bias. It's a decision. Is this jump? Is this inference? Okay. So do the Libet results generalize from arbitrary to deliberate decisions? So some decisions that we make in life are arbitrary. Let's say that you drive down a 3-lane freeway and you're driving in the middle lane for some reason. It's actually allowed in California. You can drive in any lane that you want. I know it's strange, but that's what we do here. But anyway, so you can drive you're driving in the middle lane and you see that it's closed. Now let's say it's the middle of the night, the road is empty. So this lane is closed. You can overtake it from the right, you can overtake it from the left. There is no reason for you to decide one thing versus another. It really doesn't matter. So that's an arbitrary decision. And again, some decisions really are arbitrary in life. Other decisions are deliberate. So imagine the same situation, but now you see this lane is closed and there's a car to your right. Okay. In this situation, you're not going to move to the right. Okay, you're going to make a deliberate decision. There is now a reason for you not to move to the right. Now, I mean, that reason doesn't even have to be external. There's an acquaintance of mine who once shared with me that because of political ideology, they would rather make 3 left turns and make a single right turn. So that person too would not go to the right, even if there was not a car here, right? Anyway, it could be internal, it could be external, but the bottom line is that deliberate decisions are ones that can be decided according to reasons. There are reasons for you to do one thing versus another. So historically, the neuroscience of volition really focused on arbitrary decisions. These Libet experiment, raise your right hand or your left hand for no reason and no purpose. The John Dillon-Haynes experiment, press a button with your right hand or left one with no reason and no purpose. The Fried et al. Experiment in humans implanted with electrodes, again, they were just they were pressing a button, I think, with the right or left hand, again, no reason and no purpose. So there's a reason for it. I think that people focused on arbitrary decisions because arbitrary decisions are viewed as like distilled decisions. They're not contaminated by any reasons. So if you really want to study, some sense, pure volition, then without any kind of preferences or values, then you go for arbitrary decisions. Of course, the problem with arbitrary decisions is, well, I would say there are actually a few problems. One, arbitrary decisions are really trivial. You could even say that they're degenerate. Okay, they're just, you have to decide whether to raise your right hand or your left hand for no reason and no purpose. You're just breaking the symmetry. It doesn't really matter. You just have to, noise can decide it, right? The second thing is that if you're interested in consciousness, and we talked about, the role of consciousness in legal cases and so on. If you're interested in consciousness, you could claim that consciousness is more involved in deliberate decisions, right? And when you talk about moral responsibility, you're surely talking about deliberate decisions. Nobody's going to take you to court because you decided to raise your right hand and not your left hand for no reason and no purpose. If raising your right hand now is morally meaningful, I don't know, if you see a car that's burning and there's a baby inside, raising your right hand means you're going to run to the car and save the baby. Your left hand, you're going to stand there with your cell phone, take pictures and go. So, well, in that situation, now your decision is meaningful. Okay. So we wanted to compare directly arbitrary and deliberate decisions. And the way we did that is we created this nonprofit, or we call it the NPO's task. And we took various nonprofit organizations, okay, and we took subjects who we pre-screened them to care about social or be socially involved, care about social situations. So they volunteered in nonprofits, they donated to nonprofits, they voted, and so on. And we took some nonprofits that generally, kind of like you might maybe call them vanilla flavored. People tend to say that you should conserve things. You should fight hunger, and so on. But then we also took some things that were controversial, at least in the U.S. Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Are you pro-guns or anti-guns? Are you pro or anti the use of marijuana? That one at least has been decided in California. Are you pro or anti the use of stem cells, and so on? So the point is that we asked people, we gave them different nonprofits, and we asked them, how much would you like to donate $1,000 to this nonprofit? From 1, let's say, to 7. Okay, 7 being I really, really, really want to donate, to 1 being absolutely not. And we told these people, and this was actually true, that $1,000 would be donated in the end. So it's real. It's not just imaginary situation, right? So these people had deliberate decisions where, let's say, maybe the decision was hard. Maybe they, like Cancer Research Institute for them was maybe a 5, and the Hunger Project was a 7. So we gave them that, and they deliberated a bit more. And then they had some easy decisions where, for maybe the difference between these two is really large for them, they really prefer much to the other, then it's an easy decision. Okay, so they had deliberate decisions. Now they also had arbitrary decisions. In arbitrary decisions, they also got 2 nonprofits, and they had to supposedly decide between them. However, we told them, no matter which button you press now, both nonprofits are going to get $500. So now it's not a deliberate decision anymore. It doesn't matter which button you press. You just have to press one of the buttons because, again, no matter what, both of them are going to get $500. So what do we see here? If you look at the behavior of the subjects, you can see this is their reaction time in hard decisions, their reaction times in easy decisions, and then arbitrary in blue, deliberate in red. So we can see that deliberate decisions take longer than arbitrary decisions. The reaction times are longer, as you'd expect. We can also see that if the decisions are hard, they tend to take longer than if decisions are easy. And we also, if we look at how consistent so if you gave somebody something that's a 7 versus something that's a 3, right? Because we asked them to rate in the beginning how much they want to contribute. So you'd expect them to choose the 7 over the 3. And we see that they really do that for deliberate decisions, but not really for arbitrary, as you'd expect, because an arbitrary decision doesn't matter what you press. Okay, so the behavior made sense. Now let's look at what happened in the brain. So for arbitrary decisions, you're starting to see this downward trend that is typical. These are different subjects are here in different colors. This is a subject by subject analysis, but for deliberate decisions, you don't really see this downward trend. It's kind of flat. If you look at the overall average over all subjects, you can see, again, this thing that looks like a readiness potential for arbitrary decisions, but not for deliberate ones. And basically the statistics shows you that it is really, that you don't really have something in the deliberate case, but you do have a readiness potential in the arbitrary case. So it seems from this study that the readiness potentials do not generalize to deliberate decisions. We just don't see them in deliberate decisions. So we ran a bunch of control analyses, various control analyses that I'm not going to go into right now. If there are questions about it in the end, we can discuss it. About differences in reaction times, did they affect this, differences in eye movements, stimulus-locked EEG activity, does that have an effect, the effect of the hand used to respond, maybe the filtering method that we used. There were a lot of others. We ran various analyses. Interestingly, there's the readiness potential. There's another thing called the lateralized readiness potential. Now, the lateralized readiness potential is more motor related. Okay, it's related more to your movement, your actions. Now, in this study, the point is, right, we have in arbitrary and in deliberate decisions, you get the same visual input. You see two nonprofits, you have to decide between them. You do the same motor output. You press a button with your left hand or another button with your right hand. However, the meaning of all of this is different. Like one time you do this, it's deliberate. Another time you do it, it's an arbitrary decision. But the movement is the same. And you can see here that the lateralized readiness potential that tends to reflect movement more is really the same. You do not see difference between deliberate and arbitrary decisions here. It's all together. So that's a nice finding too. Now, again, we developed this. It's called a drift diffusion model. We developed this drift diffusion model in this case, and what we showed in that drift diffusion model was that if you plug in all the information, you get that you get the results that you expect. You get the you get this thing, you get the arbitrary decisions creating this thing that looks like a readiness potential, and these deliberate decisions look like, not like readiness potentials. This is an expansion of a model that Aaron Sugar and colleagues developed in 2012. So bottom line, what's the conclusion from all of this? Well, we see neural signals that are associated with arbitrary decisions, and they do not generalize to deliberate decisions. So whatever threat these deliberate results pose to our notion of volition, it doesn't seem like that threat generalizes to deliberate decisions, okay? And again, arguably, those are the decisions we care more about when we think about free will, and certainly when we think about moral responsibility. And I would claim that after our experiment, you cannot just do an experiment about arbitrary decisions and say, yeah, sure, it generalizes to deliberate decisions. You have to show that it does. Okay, so this work was done with Liad Mudrik, Gideon Yaffe, and Christoph Koch. And again, going back to this inference, I would say that I think we've provided some decent evidence that deliberate experiments do not generalize to deliberate decisions. Okay, and I think another thing, this is what I've said already, I think another thing is that the neuroscience of volition should, and by the way, is moving beyond the beyond deliberate experiments. And it's trying to do some other things. Now, I wanted to say a few things about what is the neural substrate of the readiness potential, but given the time, I think I'll skip that a little bit. And not a little bit, I'll just skip that. And instead, I'll just move right ahead and talk a little bit more about what's happened now in our field. So our field, as I mentioned, historically, this is a joint work that I decided not to discuss. I'll move ahead with from that in a moment. But, oh, this is now jumping ahead a little bit here, I'm sorry. But anyway, before I talk about that project, I wanted to mention one more thing. I want to say that our field has really began paying more attention to deliberate decisions. This field that was really focused on arbitrary decisions has started paying more attention to deliberate decisions, which is something that Liad Mudrik, my collaborator, and I have been pushing for a while. And what you can see is that actually there are, besides our study, there are now a few other studies that seem to suggest that there are differences between arbitrary and deliberate decisions in the brain, although there are also studies that claim that they could not find those differences. So there's a bit of a debate going on, which is how science moves along. And that's a good thing, of course. Now, I just wanted to give you for a moment here, these are the references that I mentioned in this talk. If you want to learn more about them, then they're here. And to conclude, I wanted to tell you about something that Renato mentioned in the beginning about this large international project that investigates how the brain enables causal conscious control of action. So this is the slide that decided to jump ahead, or maybe my PowerPoint has its own free will, who knows? But anyway, so this is as I mentioned before, I really think that neuroscientists cannot study free will or consciousness or emotions or all these very high level concepts on their own. The reason is simple. Neuroscientists are not trained to do conceptual analysis, to understand the difference between an urge and a desire and a wish and a will and a decision and an intention. And I think philosophers are. So if you're a neuroscientist who is studying whether some channel in the brain of whichever creature that you're studying, does it respond to this stimulus or that stimulus, then I think you don't need your personal philosopher to do that with you. But if you want to study these high level concepts that I mentioned, consciousness, free will, maybe emotions and other things, you want to make sure that you've got your concepts straight, that you're not studying the wrong thing. So what we did is we put together a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers. I think at this point, we're roughly, I think it's maybe 9 neuroscientists and 11 philosophers involved in this project, including some collaborators here. This is like the core group, and then we have a few collaborators here. We are spread throughout North America, Europe, Asia, Australia. And we are collaborating. We have joint talks, seminars, and we have some even funding for some international competitions that happen every year. For students and postdocs, for talks, for like some small stipend, I don't know about small, but like 1 to 2 years of research stipends and so on. But the point is really here for the neuroscientists and the philosophers to work together. Everything that we do, it always involves neuroscientists and philosophers working together. All the projects here have neuroscientists and philosophers working together. And you can see that also in a book that we've been working on that's going to come out in November by Oxford University Press. It's called Free Will, Philosophers and Neuroscientists in Conversation. And in this book, we had a similar idea. So we asked all the philosophers, what would you like to know from the neuroscientists about free will? What is of most interest to you? And we asked neuroscientists the same thing about philosophers. And we collected, then we had people vote on, because we got about 40, 50 questions for each group to the other. We voted on the top 15. The group kind of voted on the top 15 from each. So then we ended up with 30 chapters overall. And then in each chapter we asked the neuroscientists to respond to the question from philosophers and vice versa. And then people could ask follow-up questions and so on. But we ended up with these 30 chapters that you see in front of you. So questions that neuroscientists wanted to ask philosophers are these simple questions. What is an intention? What is will? What is an action? When is an action voluntary? What is freedom? What is free will? And so on. And then philosophers tended to ask neuroscientists also these very simple questions, like what are the main stages in the neural processes that produce actions? Does the will correspond to a clearly delineated brain area or activity, and so on? So the book, as I mentioned, is going to come out in November with these questions and answers and so on, if you're interested to hear more about this. And again, the thing that we are very proud about this is that it's really all neuroscientists and philosophers working together. I should mention that this group is also seeking postdocs, PhD students, and so on. You can find more information here about the group, and this is my email if you're interested. I think I'll stop here and take your questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Uri. That was quite impressive, especially the way you organize the flow of information. I really like the way you started. I better use a phone because it's having some sort of yeah. How does it sound now? Better. Okay. Yeah. How does it sound now? Better. Okay.
I hear you well.
Yeah, now it's okay because I have to set up my computer. Yeah, now it's okay because I have to set up my computer. Sorry? Strange. Sorry? Strange.
Me. Let me try to do something about that as well. 1 sec. Let me, it sometimes happens from my computer, and I can easily switch to something else here. So give me 1 second. I think we can solve this. 1 second, please.
Yeah, your new device is connecting now. Yes, perfect.
I think it might have been my computer. So in this case, you should be hearing me well now.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Uri, first of all, congratulations. It was a great talk. I love the way you organize the flow of information, because you start with we started with the traditional question of free will and philosophy, and then you move on to the traditional approach and the liberal-like experiments, and in the way you're going, you're increasing, let us say, the ecological relevance of the experiments you're analyzing, and that's something remarkable, especially about your 2019 experiments, which I consider a benchmark. I mean, I'm not trying to be flattering here. I really think it's necessary to understand that this experiment establishes something very important. First of all, I mean, I think I said that to Adina today. I'm sorry if I'm repeating too much myself about this issue, but I think the most important discovery of Libet was not the temporal order of his event. It's the fact that you have a readiness potential type 1 and a readiness potential type 2. And I think readiness potential type 1 somehow implies some sort of consciousness by implying some sort of pre-planning, right? That's my interpretation of the experiment. So what we did in 2019, in the 2019 publication, was first to disentangle the readiness, the central readiness potential for the lateralized readiness potential, which is a very important step that Haggard was already working on, but in a much more ecologically relevant way. I also cited some experiments that deal with readiness potential in sports physiology combined with neuroscience, and we see how much those potentials are unspecific of the sort of decision, but really specific in terms of the moral action related to it. For example, I cited the experiment that shows that experts archers have much larger herpes, and the onset it's just very late compared to novices. So I mean, I think after your experiment and this new line of research in sports physiology, neuroscience, I mean, it's each day more clear that the readiness potential is much more the onset of a motor action, and we have to shift gears to pre-planning, to also repression of inappropriate behavior, and other, I'll say, executive functions, frontal lobes, and that's exactly why your 2019 experiment is so important. I would like to see what you have to say when it comes down to the structure of this experiment, because I mean it's really ecologically relevant. It's really ecologically valid because I mean the donations. We had also a Brazilian that was a pioneer in this field, Jorge Maoz Neto. They worked with donations as well. When you compare the results you had in terms of prediction in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with let's say more reptilian brain areas, what you can tell about those specific different results and what kind of light they will shed in this difference between a more stereotype, more moral action and more deliberate actions in terms of brain areas, what you could bring to us that will help us understand the different relevant contributions of different brain circuits. That's my first question.
Well, again, I didn't go into all the details. I felt my talk was already long enough. But one thing, I mentioned that model that we developed for the 2019, the eLife paper. And in that model, I think there's an interesting, we know where, so if you measure CZ, if you measure the basically it seems like the SMA, pre-SMA area, you can see the readiness potential, but we could not see a readiness potential for a deliberate decision. Now, of course, it's not that deliberate decisions come from the kidneys or from the legs or from your knee. It's just from another part in the brain. Now, and there are neuroeconomists and others who study decision making in the brain, and some regions of the brain, like the ventral striatum, that you asked about also in the monkey studies, but also the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and other regions, really they seem to mediate these deliberate decisions. And I think, so the way I think about it, if I understand correctly your question, you're asking about, so wait, you've got your deliberate decisions, arbitrary ones, how do they come together? If I understand that correctly, also for the monkeys. Well, I think that what happens is, if you insist on studying these less ecological arbitrary decisions, then, and you try to predict what's going to happen there, what you're basically focusing on is the noise. You're trying, because all you have is symmetry breaking, and you find this noise. Now, if you're focusing on this noise, and now you're trying to look at deliberate decisions, this noise is not important for predictions anymore. And it's not important for prediction because in deliberate decisions, it's actually rare that the noise would decide what's happening. Typically, somebody, whatever. You have your values, right? Your decisional, the preferences. Those are the things that decide what you would do. And Although, by the way, it's interesting. I didn't mention it, but I mentioned that in the monkey study that we did, sometimes the monkeys were asked, "Do you want less juice now or more juice now?" Now, what the monkeys should say, "I want more juice now." They're thirsty. Supposedly, they want more juice. Okay. So, and that's what they did about 95% of the time. They said, "I want more juice now." But 5% of the time, roughly, they said, "I want less juice now." And we looked a little bit, 5%, it's just very few trials. It's hard to do too much of that. But we looked at those trials and we said, well, are they just towards the end of the day, the monkey just is not thirsty anymore? They had so much juice, they're enough. Even my kids, sometimes you give them too much juice, they just don't want any more juice, right? So maybe it's that. Or maybe it's something else. And we were wondering, is the bias activity in those trials where the monkey makes a mistake, supposedly, is the bias especially high? And the answer was actually yes. And again, I'm not making too much of this. It was just a line in the paper because we didn't have enough trials to, it is, I think it was even significant, but it's not, but still, this goes back to this model that I think is an interesting model. Again, typically when you make deliberate decisions, you have values that guide you. But remember, it's a noisy decision. And sometimes, just sometimes, the noise is so large that it can overtake you. And that, of course, in my opinion, I'm deliberating this with some of the philosophers, and they don't always agree with me. But I think, in my opinion, it means this has some moral values. So let's say, I don't know, you go somewhere and somebody starts, I don't know, they get on your nerves and so on. And usually you just say, look, man, enough. I'm just going to go home. I don't want to talk to you or whatever. But one time out of 20, you get upset, you turn around, you punch them in the nose. Now, you're responsible for that. But if you could show that it's the noise now and not you, then maybe you're less responsible. Again, I don't know, but I think it's if you have this noisy thing, and then you can say, well, I just the stars aligned really badly for me. But again, I don't know. Maybe it's maybe I'm missing something. But I think it's actually I like that model. But I'm not sure, Gabriel. Did I answer your question properly?
Yeah, but I have a follow-up exactly because I kind of predicted your line of thought because I knew that you were going to mention the monkeys experiment. I have two questions about that. Can you, considering evolution, can we assume for sure that monkeys will be much more hyperbolic discounters than human beings? That will be much more exponential. It's a very, it's a simple question in terms of evolution, but I mean, it's at least a tendency that we have to assume that. And the second question is more technical. How do you manage to avoid that the monkey was entering into ad libitum level of satisfaction,
So to your first question, so Dale Lee and others had looked into this, and really, as you said, for the monkeys, they could show that the hyperbolic model was explaining the questions better than the exponential hyperbolic decision making. But I have to say, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. So I'm not an expert in that. But I guess to your more general question of how much are these monkeys? How much can we trust that what happens in these monkeys also happens in humans? We know that some things are that monkeys, for instance, if you lesion V1 in monkeys, right, the primary visual area in monkeys, it seems to bother them much less than when people have a stroke in their V1. So monkeys are by no means a perfect model for humans. And of course, the nice thing about doing these kinds of experiments in humans, you can ask them things like, so what did that feel like? What did you mean? Did you feel a sense of agency over that? And so on. With the monkeys, you cannot. But I should say, I'm not a monkey neurophysiologist. I was working with Dale Lee on that, on some data that they published before, that they published already. We just reanalyzed it. But I would agree with you that the monkeys are an imperfect model for human decisions. And I've not done a lot of work on monkeys also because there are some potential ethical issues. There are it's also, by the way, a very hard field. It's monkey neurophysiologists like their experiment done just in a very specific way, and if you do anything else, they don't like it. So I found it a very anal field. But I think that, I mean, some things can only be done, at least that's how we think about this ethically, can only be done in monkeys. Now, your second question, sorry, remind me
about repetitions of trial and ad libitum state.
Oh, so, well, these monkeys did do, I think, 250,000 trials overall over many, many months. Again, by the way, that's, in my opinion, another problem in the monkey field. Typically, to publish a paper about monkeys, you have to show that in that brain area that you're looking at least 10% of the neurons do this task that you're interested in. The problem is that you have monkeys who just did 250,000 trials over the past few months. So probably half their brain is now active when these trials are there. Do you really know that brain region is going to be active if you just took a monkey from the wild and you asked them, or if you took a human? So you've got the problem of going from this monkey to the monkey from the wild, and then from the monkey to the wild to humans. So it's a bit difficult. So in that sense, you have a really overtrained monkey. And I think if you were pointing at that with your question, then I agree. I mean, yeah. I don't know that the DLPFC of a monkey from the wild would be the same, but I mean, no monkey from the wild could even do this experiment. These are monkeys who were trained to see there was a green dot and a red dot, and they figured out that the red dot is the delayed reward and the green dot is the immediate reward. And then there were dots, there were specks around the dots, these small points around the dots, and these points kind of counted down the seconds until, I mean, it took them many, many months to train the monkeys to do this. And at that point, how you have your usual situation of, well, how much is it ecological? I don't know, but I think it tells us something about to the question we were asking about whether you can see some information in the brain before you even show the monkey the stimulus. I think that's interesting. Now, again, if you took a regular monkey off the streets or off the jungle, I don't know that you would necessarily get this, but I still think that it's interesting that it's there.
Okay, a little follow-up, and then I pass the word to Renato. Sure. I mean, just hypothetical, I don't know if it did that. In the original article, I know that was not done. But if you split the data in two, do you think the monkeys that were previously more hyperbolical discounters turns into a little bit more exponential discounters, kind of getting closer to us?
Yeah, as you said, we just didn't do this analysis. One analysis that we did do, we were wondering, I mean, you get these 50-50 situations, right, that we were trying to predict. So one thing we were wondering is whether maybe if the monkeys just see something that they can't decide whether they want, they just do the same thing they did in the previous trial or something like that. So these kinds of things we looked into, and we actually could not find a clear, a clear situation where they always took what they did in the previous trial or something like that. But what you asked is an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if others have looked into it. As I mentioned, people in the neuroeconomics field, like Deo Lee, have looked into these general questions. But that's actually an interesting question. I mean, it's something that can be easily done.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can ask Deo Lee if they've ever done it. I don't know.
Yeah. Please, Renato, and then Santiago.
Uri, thank you very much for your presentation, for your talk. It's very, very interesting, as always. I would like to ask you something about the different studies that did not find neurodifferences between arbitrary and deliberate decisions. Because of course you might have you have an opinion on that. Two of them, one that did find and one that did not find, they came from the same lab, from Harvard's lab, and that is also something I find interesting. I'd like to know your take on this. Do you see any essential methodological differences? Do you have an idea as to why this is the design has led to this, or do you see any kind of elements that we can point to?
Right. Yeah. So the model that I tend to have is this, as I mentioned, this noisy scales model. And if you take that model seriously, then you would say that a study that focuses on that focuses on the noise would not see the readiness potential. And a study that really focuses on the deliberate, where the noise should not have an effect, should see that. So, of the two studies that did not find it, one of them was by Verbaschott, Farquhar, and Hasselager, 2019. They had, so first of all, that was a much more complex study. These people there played a video game where they were supposed to save, I think it was called Save Willie or something like that. They were supposed to save these whales, and these other people were trying to capture the whale, and they needed to score. It was a very complex thing, and you were supposed to make these decisions. And some of them were arbitrary and some of them were deliberate. In the arbitrary case, they were pressing buttons as well, but there was this kind of like a star that like the decisions were meaningless, and then in the other one, the decisions were supposedly going to save the whale or not. Now, I should say that one difference between their experiment and ours, in our experiment, it was $1,000 that would go to hungry kids, perhaps. Here, it was some kind of an online whale that you either did or didn't care about, whether somebody's going to incarcerate it or not. I want to claim that the decisions were not that meaningful. So if the decisions are not that meaningful and you don't care about them that much, and if you just let your noise decide it, then I would say that you would get a readiness potential. To some extent, the same happened with Perez, Pujolar, Travers, Ametuglu, and Haggard paper. That's the 2021 paper that did not find the same results as ours. Again, I think it was a more, let's say, a less meaningful decision. The one where they did find it was also interesting because Patrick and I talked. So Patrick Haggard and I talked about that. I mean, he's one of the people on the grant. And originally, when they looked at it, they kind of said, "Well, we didn't really find it, interestingly." But then, by the time it was published, they did find it, because I think some of the reviewers asked them some hard questions, and in the end, they kind of flipped their position and they realized that it's actually there. And when you look more closely, and again, I would argue. I have to say, I don't remember exactly what all those experiments are. I can take a look. I have those papers, but I've read them last for a few months ago, and I've read a lot of other papers since then. But I think that the experiment in the one where they did find it was, again, the decision was somewhat more meaningful. I think that, if I remember, again, I hope I remember this properly, but I think there was about some kind of a delay, like you could either wait for a long time for something to happen or just kind of move on yourself or something like that. So it had a bit more of a meaningful situation. I should say one last thing here. A big question is how, again, we are quite confident that our experiment is solid, but the question is, how much would it replicate if we tried other things? So we are ourselves, Liad and I, trying to do some kind of replications to look at. One thing we're trying to look at is, for instance, drinks. We ask people, we give them, some drinks are more, appetitive, orange juice, apple juice, and some of them are like diluted wasabi or diluted soy sauce or fun things like that. And then we ask you, what do you want? And I think that we're wondering whether we're going to get the same thing here, because, it's like a midway situation. In some sense, most of the decisions are about like apple juice or orange juice. So even though you might care, you don't care maybe that much. But again, if our model is right, you really have to, there needs to be a strong weight that's put on the deliberate decisions. It should not be the noise, because then you get back to your readiness potential. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Please,
Sure.
Santiago, your turn.
Uri, hi. Thank you for your talk.
Hey, Santiago.
Hey, so I want to ask you a question about arbitrary versus deliberate decisions. And in particular about a certain kind of decisions, whether in your book that would be deliberate or arbitrary. So these are decisions where you are facing alternatives that are on a par, or decisions where the alternatives are incommensurable. Okay, so these seem to be cases in which the decisions are, in a sense, deliberate. You have to think hard to get to that conclusion, and you think hard about them. But in another sense, they're kind of arbitrary, because there's no reason to prefer one over the other. There are reasons to take either of them, but not one over the other. And the reason I'm asking you this question is because many, especially incompatibilists and libertarians, have thought that it's with respect to those kinds of decisions that those kinds of decisions are paradigmatically the free decisions. So I wanted to ask you whether you classify those as arbitrary or deliberate, and whether you think there are, as it were, brain-related reasons to think that they will go on once, they will invoke certain parts of the brain that either of the two would not invoke.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. So when we started the experiment, we thought that we would give you deliberate decisions where, let's say, there's something that you rated as a 3 versus something you rated as a 7. That would be a deliberate. And then if we give you two things that you rated as a 7, maybe that would be arbitrary. Those are these more equal value, let's say, decisions. We decided not to go that route for a few reasons. But I think a central one is that, let's say that you ranked, I asked you about, I don't know, some nonprofit about saving the whales and another one about saving the trees. And you rank them both as 7. You think they're equally important. However, if I give you one versus the other, you might actually have a preference. It's not necessarily going to be arbitrary. And so you might think that both of them are really worthy of $1,000, but maybe, let's say, earlier this year you made a $50 contribution to Save the Whales. So now you're saying to yourself, you know what? I already made $50 to them. I'll make the $1,000 to the other one, or something like that. So now it's no longer an arbitrary decision for you. So, and that's why we went for this perhaps weird situation where we said, okay, here are the two, the visual input is the same, right? You see the two decisions. The only thing that's different is the situation, right? Because one time you press the button and that decides $1,000. The other time, no matter which button you press, they both get 500. So that's specifically regarding our experiment. That's why we went to that type of picking. And I would actually say that there are not even just these two types of picking. There are actually a third type of picking. So there's this picking where you have a preference, but you cannot express it because we tell you no matter what you do, both get 500. There's the one that I mentioned, that it seems that the values are the same, the equal values. And there's actually the third type of picking that I think is more the limit type, which is, do you want to contribute to save the whales or to save the whales? So if I would show you both on both sides of the screen the same nonprofit, then arguably you really in the limit situation. Do you want to raise your right hand or your left hand? Doesn't really matter. I mean, unless your right hand hurts now and now you're going to raise your left, but under normal situations. So I think that, so one thing I should say, what we know is that if we give you arbitrary decisions where it's, do you want, save the whales versus save the whales, apple juice versus apple juice, or something like that, your reaction time is really fast. You recognize that there are no reasons and you just do something, you break the symmetry. If, however, I give you save the whales versus save the trees, that both of them are a 7, you may perceive that as a very hard decision. You really want to support both of them. Actually, if you could only, you would give 500 to each, maybe. If you could, you would split it, but you can't. So now you have to decide. And you really want to support both. And, if you could split the money, maybe you do, 650 versus 3, whatever, but you can't. So now you could have people deliberating for a really long time. So I think in that sense, not all deliberate decisions were created equal. there are, again, at least these three types of deliberate decisions. Sorry, arbitrary. So not all types of arbitrary decisions were created equal. It's also true of deliberate. Deliberate, you have hard and easy, but for arbitrary, you've got these arbitrary decisions that actually take the least time of any kind of decision, and you have those that actually take the longest time. But I don't know whether the ones that take the longest time are really completely arbitrary. They might be. One thing, again, it seems that way at least. If you get two job offers and they really seem equally good, maybe one of them is at a university that's, I don't know, the salary is higher, but the location is not so good. The other one, the location is great, but the salary is not so good, whatever, something like that. We hate to make decisions like that. You're going to start calling your friends that maybe went to that university and you ask them about it. And then, you check about how much you can really buy with that because the standard of living in that city is high or low. You would try to make it a non-arbitrary decision. We hate making arbitrary decisions about things that really matter to us. You could take like maybe paradigmatic situation, right? You get 2 cartons of milk, you have to decide between them. Okay, you grab one of them. Now you take 2 cartons of milk, you have to decide between them. And I tell you, by the way, one of them is poison, but there's no way for you to know which one. Now you have to take one of them and drink. Of course, you're, oh my God, but there's no reason for you to do that. But I don't think I would be in a hurry to drink either one of those. So does that answer your question, Santiago? I hope so.
Yeah, I think you said you classified them like the kind of decisions that I was talking about as arbitrary.
Yeah, there is, I guess.
So the question would be whether in those cases you would find the kind of patterns of neural activation that we're talking about and that you think are not present in deliberate decisions.
So I think that if you gave me apple juice versus apple juice, I would see a readiness. But we actually have some evidence of that. We've looked at that. If you ask me whether I get it for the second type, we already showed it here. The third type is if it's a really, really hard decision. First of all, in this situation, we did not see differences between hard and easy decisions in terms of the size of the readiness potential. That's why it seemed like a bit more of like an all or none situation. If you think about picking or arbitrary decisions as like an extreme case of a hard decision, then we should have maybe seen a readiness condition because we saw it for these hard decisions, but we didn't here. So I think, we have not really tried these very hard decisions. I'm not sure what we were going to get. There is another interesting part here that was Richard Holton from Cambridge brought that up. This is, I think it comes from Sartre's example of somebody who is deliberating between, this is in the Second World War, and you guys probably know this example better than I do. The Second World War, and France is occupied by the Germans, and this guy is deliberating between joining the resistance movement or staying and helping his aging mother. And it's a really difficult decision. Now, but in some sense, you might say that these two decisions are incommensurable. And in the sense in which they're incommensurable is, so if I asked you, do you want to save the whales or save the trees? And which one do you want to give $1,000 to? You might be, I don't know, I really want to, but I say, okay, how about if I say to you now, you can give $1,001 to save the whales, but only $1,000 to save the trees. Which one do you want? Oh, now it's easy. I want to save the whales. So this $1, even maybe 1 cent, the sweetening of this 1 cent would make all the difference. So what happens in the example of Sartre? Now I tell you, well, if you go and join the resistance, I'll give you 1 franc, $1, whatever. Now you might even feel insulted. What do you mean? Are you going to give me $1? That's going to make a difference. Now I'm going to leave my mother for $1? So in those situations where we call it incommensurable, there's this sense in which there's, it's not that like adding another $1 is going to make a difference, another cent. So it's like sweetening proof, maybe it's what you would call it. And actually, together with Richard Holton, Liad and I are looking into this now. It's an empirical question. What would happen? What would people think? What would they do? So I don't have the answer yet. We're really just working on the paradigm, but I recognize that it's an interesting question. So again, I hope that's maybe another answer to your question, Santiago.
Okay, thanks Santiago for the brilliant questions. Thanks Uri for the brilliant answers. There's a question from Davi Cecílio Moura Abreu. It's a more metaphysically driven questions. I know you are a scientist, but as you work very closely with philosophers, let's see what you say. He says, how can we interpret cerebral activity as identical to mental activity, or as causing it, or as a correlation?
Cerebral activity and mental activity. Yeah. Well, as you said, this is more of a metaphysical question, and I'm not sure that as a neuroscientist, I am especially equipped to answer that question. I measure brain activity. And I mean, my own metaphysical leaning is towards a physicalist leaning, which then makes this question important, right? Okay, so you think that the mental somehow resides on the physical, but then what kind of how does it reside exactly? And my problem here is this: whichever answer I give you, I can think of problems with that answer. So, and that's, by the way, again, for me, that's honestly one of the reasons that I work with philosophers. I mean, instead of an answer, I'll tell you a short story of how I started working with philosophers, but it relates to this answer. So in 2008, that actually experiment of John Denton Haynes that I just mentioned here came out. And I was very excited. I read about it. Wow, 8 seconds in advance, you can tell this and that. And I met a philosopher friend of mine. And I told him about this experiment. And, it took like 20 minutes. I went through all the fMRI analysis, and we did this and the MVPA and all that. And then in the end, he says, okay, so what? I said, you didn't understand. Let me explain again. And I went like another 10 minutes of this and that. I said, no, okay, I really think I understand the experiment. I just don't understand why you're so excited. And I said, well, what do you mean? I said, okay, let me try to explain why I think. And I said, he said, well, what about, do you know that these are really arbitrary decisions? How do you know that a generalized deliberate decision? How do you know that it's really bias activity? I mean, that it's really the decision has been made and you're not just kind of picking up on some kind of bias activity. And then, I mean, within about 5 minutes, he convinced me that there are so many problems with this experiment. Again, some of those I've been studying since. And that convinced me of 2 things. One, I'm a bad philosopher. Second thing is I should work with good philosophers so that we can think about the concepts carefully, and so that we don't work on things that we don't understand. So going back to this question, I don't have an answer. And I mean, in a similar sense, you can ask me, is it better to plant tree A or tree B in area C of the world? I don't have a privileged answer to that. And as a scientist, I don't know. What I can say is that I like to work with people who have thought about this a lot, so that at least when I do my experiment, I can understand together with them what assumptions we are making that are driving our experiment. And at least we wouldn't just be, I mean, in some sense you could say that Libet had some idea of what volition is. He just went ahead with that and that's it. And, never really questioned it much. We hope to do better. And I mean, Renato and I are also involved in an experiment with Marcel Brass. And again, we thought long and hard about what exactly it is that we're studying. And again, it was Renato who sometimes said, well, this doesn't make sense because of this and that. And that's the input that we like. So I don't have an answer to the question. I agree it's an important one. And I agree that sometimes it drives your experiments, and you better take that into account when you're running them. So I'm sorry if that's disappointing to whoever asked, but that's the best I can do as a non-expert.
No, that's great. There's another question from another student that asks if you think that moral decision-making is more complex to be tested than other forms of decision-making. I mean, if they were more difficult to be predicted, that's exactly why.
Oh, more predicted, I see. So one thing is that it's actually more difficult to be tested. because most moral decisions are, imagine yourself walking by the side of a train tracks with with a runaway trolley just traveling by you, and you have to, I mean, yeah, I can easily imagine myself the same way I can imagine myself landing on Mars and encountering two types of Martian creatures, and I have to decide which one of them to kill. Why would I go to Mars? Why do I want to kill these creatures and all? So, I mean, here, of course, it's not as bad. I can maybe try to imagine myself, and probably like most people, in this trolley problem, I would switch it to kill just one person instead of five if I had to, and so on. But it's all imagined. I should say, by the way, that one of the things we're trying to do is actually put people in a VR situation and see what they would really do. But that's a virtual reality, right? But that aside, I think that moral decisions are typically hard to study because of ethical reasons. I mean, you would never want to put a student in a situation where they really have to make a really strong moral decision. And because we and so most people just say imagine, and when you imagine, then I mean, I think you're basically asking people what should be done and not what they would actually do. And as psychology, I mean, perhaps you would say as moral philosophers, we care about what we should do, and that's fine. But perhaps as psychologists, we also care about what people would do. And it's very hard to predict what people would do from, if they tell you what they should do. It's actually easy to predict what people would tell you that they have done, because they typically tell you that they have done the thing that they think they should do. But if you sometimes check what they really did, then it gets more complicated. And again, there are actually some experiments like that. What it was something about. So that you take people. This was done, I think, in the 70s. You take people and you ask them. So if an old lady walks by and drops whatever $5, something that's it's a good amount of money, but it's not something that's going to change your life. Like $5, would you pick it up and give it to the old lady? And I don't know, 80% of the people say yes. Now you ask that, and you ask them 100 other questions. Then when they walk out of the experiment, lo and behold, there's an old lady walking by. Lo and behold, she drops $5. And again, you were asked hundreds of questions. You're not going to remember that specific question. Only 60% of the people give the money back. The other 20% said you should, but there's no camera around, I think. Nobody's looking. This is actually great for lunch. I just forgot my wallet just today. I really need this money much more than this old lady. She looks like she has a lot of money. Whatever you tell yourself, I don't know. But so I think it's important to actually measure what people do. And I mean, Renato visited us at the Brain Institute. I think you saw our driving simulator when you were visiting. We put quite a bit of effort, time, and money into creating that, because once you start driving around, and at some point you start feeling like you're in this, it's like the Matrix a little bit, like the movie, you're driving around. Now it can spring something on you that would be, I believe, a more real situation. Of course, without you actually having to run anybody over, you can stop it just before there's anything really bad happening on the screen. But I can make you make a decision that is more real. And I think there's a whole cottage industry about trolley problems of this and that, but I don't know how much, again, they study what we should do, and I think that's interesting. But so I hope I answered the question. But so in terms of actually predicting, to be able to say something meaningful here, we would need some data. And in my opinion, there isn't enough good data yet. And I would suggest to that student of yours who's thinking about this to start thinking about the right kind of experiments to do. And if they have a good experiment, email me. Gabriel, you're muted. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you.
Sorry, I was just asking if Santiago was still going for a follow-up, or he just forgot their hand raised. Santiago, you have a follow-up? Yes, please. No, you just forgot the hand raised. Okay. Hey, Renato, do you have any follow-ups? Anyone else?
It is getting late your side of the continent.
Yeah. So yeah, we are finishing a little bit earlier.
I just have a small comment.
Yeah, please.
There is already this study made in Ghent, actually, in New Ghent, not by Marcel though, but it's the paper. It's called "Of Mice, Men, and Trolleys: Hypothetical Judgment versus Real Life Behavior in Trolley Style Moral Dilemmas." And they did it with mice. Of course, they wouldn't do it with real people, but they kind of tested this thing in real life. If people do follow up on what they said they would do the problem.
Yeah, and there are some other studies. So for instance, there's a study on the trolley problem where, I mean, usually the trolley problem, you get it written, and there's something that you answer that question, you answer it as it's written. Then they showed people pictures and things like that, and then they claimed that people became more utilitarian, so they tended more to move towards the 5 than towards the 1 if you gave them pictures of it. And there were some claims that maybe even with virtual reality you could get them to become even more utilitarian. The problem with most of these studies is that, again, they come and they ask you like 100 questions. Okay, so now the boat has sank and all these people are on the lifeboat, and now the lifeboat is sinking because there are too many people. Is it okay to throw out this guy who's barely conscious and probably not going to make it anyway, to throw them out, because then you know that the boat is not going to sink? And again, it's like, really? In real life, would you actually know that throwing this poor person off is going to save everybody else? Are you 100%? I don't know. All these things sound to me like I don't. I mean, I sometimes walk near railways, although we don't have that many in Los Angeles here. But I've never seen 5 people tied to one rail and one person tied to the other, and all those. I mean, it just seems like so outlandish, these things. So, for instance, one thing we were trying to do is, what happens if we get people to just drive around in a virtual reality situation, and then all of a sudden we make the car lose its you lose control over the car. Now, I mean, it's a self-driving car, it's driving you around, and then all of a sudden, like, it's doing something crazy. Are you going to intervene or not? Like, you can do all those things that feel to me a bit more real. And we've discussed this before. I really believe in making things more real. Otherwise, you're just talking, I don't know what it means. Somebody was writing something about a question in the chat, Gabriel. I don't know if we have access to it or not.
The last question in the Q's and A's, it goes in a absolutely different direction, as more theologically oriented. Is from Muhare Kovatli from Santa Maria, Federal University of Santa Maria. Asked, I'll read it as a long question. A sage once said, an integral determinism will demand that the supreme determining power itself will be determined by the same determining principle that it determines, which is self-contradictory. All determinism is only possible with a certain margin of freedom. It seems that these questions of free will, determinism, morals, agents moral, civic, criminal, and post-mortem responsibility, etc., can only be addressed by concrete factual analysis in order not to fall into pure abstractions or into inferring that these bias influences must be total, in-depth, and comprehensive, rather than simply partial and limited. Could you comment on that?
Well, as a neuroscientist, I think that the question of the compatibility or incompatibility of free will with determinism is not one that I'm especially able to answer. I would say that one thing that neuroscientists can do about that question is try to understand the mechanism. So if I was able to measure all the neurons in the brain, and maybe the glia cells are also important, maybe hormones are also important, whatever is important. If I was able to measure all of those, would I be able to predict the decisions? As a neuroscientist, I think that yes. perhaps, by the way, not necessarily that not necessarily 8-9 seconds in advance, because there could be noise. I mean, it could be, at least. I don't know if there is, but there could be like non-deterministic noise in the sense of even quantum, I don't know, whatever. There could be something that gets into the picture that makes the world non-deterministic. We don't know that the world is deterministic. And then you get into these questions, okay, is the noise the type of noise that you care about? Is the noise really can become a macro noise? But all those things, you need to be a physicist to answer, not me. You were asking me here about, I mean, I guess this question is in some sense whether a deterministic universe is even possible together with the notion of God or something like that. That is really beyond me. I don't know, but I do see in the Q&A there's a question about when you said I predict intention, I thought, did you believe that would be possible to predict? Oh, this is about more one. Then there's, sorry, I think you asked that one. Then there's how can we interpret cerebral activity as mental activity as causation and not correlation? Should I try to answer that, or did you ask that in some other guise and I missed it?
Feel free to respond it, please.
Okay. So how can we interpret cerebral activity as mental activity, as causation and not correlation? So the question of correlation versus causation in neural activity is, of course, it's an important one. And when you just measure EEG, you don't know if you really are just measuring correlation, right? Or you're actually measuring, is the RP causal? For instance, that's an interesting question. One thing, so one way to intervene one way to get at this is to intervene. Now, to intervene, you need to change some variable consistently and then see if something changes in the system. So as a neuroscientist, you could use transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So for instance, if you made the readiness potential go away, would it make a difference? Would it make actually would you see different effects on arbitrary and deliberate decisions? So if, again, this is if you think that the readiness potential is actually causal, and that's maybe a big if, but if you think it's causal, then if you made the RP go away using repetitive TMS or something like that, then you would expect to see some effect. So I'm not. I hope I'm answering the right question. This is what I understood from the question. But there are ways to get at causation. So one of them is going to intervene. I'm sorry. You can do it with TMS. Sometimes these people who have the electrodes in their brain for clinical purposes, you can also then try to stimulate in very mildly in some very small areas, and sometimes you see some effects on behavior. Another thing you can do, and we're trying to do actually as part of this project, is to do what's called sometimes causal modeling. So these are like mathematical techniques that try to move you from correlation to causation. They are imperfect, but they suggest that if this is causation, then this, and this would happen. So if, again, they're imperfect, and it is generally speaking hard to go from correlation to causation. But I think, and so there is a researcher at Caltech called Frederick Eberhard. He's actually in the Department of Philosophy, but he does these causal analyses and so on. And again, I mean, I'm not an expert in that, but I've been trying to work with him and to kind of co-guide one of my students who is interested in this question of causality. I hope that using these mathematical techniques and other things, and TMS and so on, we would be able to get at some kind of causal roots of these things. But I tend to agree, this is a big problem, and it's especially a big problem with these so if you think about volition, you're not sure of like what it is exactly that you're studying, because different people define it in different ways. Then if you study you cannot study it in animals that well, because you cannot ask them very often what they've done and so on. you cannot, I mean, usually in psychology and in neuroscience, you give people something to do, and then they have to do it, and then you see the relation between the stimulus and their response. But here, it's volition. So typically, you want people to somehow divorce the response from the stimulus, because it has to come from inside somehow. So like, and now you really want to get at causality. I mean, that's a general problem in neuroscience, but especially here with all these problems, you still want to get at causality. It's just very hard. But the fact that something is very hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't make the effort to do it. And we're trying, but I don't have an answer right here for you.
Okay, great. If no one else has questions, I have a little follow-up in your debate with Santiago. You commented on, decisions that which you have two incommensurable stimuli, right? And you even cited Jean-Paul Sartre, going to defending the partisans, or caring about my aging and declining mother. In Brazil, you have a strange dilemma, a strange moral dilemma. It's called, I don't know if I buy an old Beetle Volkswagen or if I marry. I mean, just to give some colors to the debate and some Brazilian flavor. But I mean, I want to hear a little about the idea of a common currency in the brain. There are some experiments that says that striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex will be possibly areas responsible for creating comparisons between goals and values, valences. I'd like to hear a little about that, on how testing incommensurable stimuli, or prima facie incommensurable stimuli, and if you believe that those publications so far exploring this are going in a good direction.
So the experiments that I know about are mainly from neuroeconomics. This is like, I think Paul Glimcher and these people talked about these, right? That's okay. So that's where economists tend to think that everything is going to be translated to money. So, okay, so $1, you're not going to join the resistance. Let me give you $100. Now you're going to join. Not yet. Well, I give you $1,000. Now you can hire a nurse to take care of your mother, and now you can join the resistance. No problem. So, and I know this is strange from somebody living in the US, but I don't think actually everything is about money. So, I mean, and the kind, and as you mentioned, I mean, there are these brain regions that were involved in these ideas of the common currency and so on. It's actually a good question, an empirical one, whether if you could create some kind of a real sweetening experiment. Of course, we're not going to put anybody in the Second World War, but something where you could check whether it's going to work or not. So I would be intrigued if, for instance, an experiment showed that these common currency areas, if they light up one way, you're going to see that the person is going to take that as no problem. Well, give me $1, I'll take it. And they light up another way, then, or they don't light up at all, or something like that. So I think that's. I have to be honest and say I haven't thought about it until you raised it now. But I think that's actually an interesting way to think about it, because if some things are incommensurable, right? Then, as you say, then somehow you're not supposed to be able to create this common currency. So now, if you were doing like MVPA, some kind of fMRI, these multivoxel predictions, then perhaps you're supposedly going to see some kind of other activity. But it's an interesting question. I don't know if these experiments have been done, and so if we see clear different activities, then I would say that it supports these regions being part of a common currency that's beyond just the economic ones. And if we don't, then it might not. But there is a warning here. There's a caveat here. The brain is mysterious in mysterious ways. So it's not just that it's mysterious. I was recently discussing with someone, and they talked about how if you study mice doing the same thing again and again, even things that we relatively know about, these place cells, they walk around a maze and we see these place cells and so on. These place cells do not stay the same, after a few days. The representation changes in the brain. Do we know why? We don't. We could have some hypotheses about why they change, but they change. So what that to me is always, hey, we should watch out. We know, sometimes we think we know more about the brain than we do. And I think we have to be quite careful. So even if, let's say, we found some different representation, if the brain keeps on changing as it seems to be doing, and we don't even know exactly why and so on, we have to be a bit modest about what we infer from brain activity about about these things like a common currency and so on. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, that was very useful. And after your answer, the only thing that I can say is that your talk was priceless.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We had a great day. I mean, I loved your talk personally. You covered a range of topics that are particularly interesting to me. And we just have to be really grateful for you having explored so complicated subjects with tremendous clarity. Thanks a lot. Flattered with your presence, and just if you want to say your last words, otherwise we're closing here.
Just that, let's see if everything goes well. Maybe we could even meet in person in December, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, let's hope for the best for all the world here.
Great.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for having the kindness to give us the pleasure to hear you. So everyone, we are back tomorrow. Have a good night of sleep. And tomorrow we have Jonathan Phillips with Eduardo Vicentini, the discussion with Matheus Silveira. That will be 10 in the morning in Brazil. Thanks a lot, everyone, for the presence, for the questions, for the debate. Renato, any words, or can we close the session?
Please do. Back tomorrow.
So, Victoria, you're